to Maddie about her book. There are loads of history books that, quite frankly, are quite boring. This isn't one of them. This really grabs you. You are really taken on a journey into the 18th century. You meet so many interesting characters along the way, but also feel like you're in really safe hands in terms of the journey and the history and all the different facets of 18th century life. Graffiti is a really interesting thing to think about, and I'd not thought about it before, but if I may, before I read this book, there was one quote that always stuck out to me in Samuel Pepys's diary, which is just a little bit before yours. And he said, first of all, for context, Lawson, who he is about to refer to, was the admiral at sea, so he was in charge of ships. And he wrote on the 7th of February, 1660, Mr. Moore told me of a picture hung up at the Exchange of a great pair of buttocks shooting of a turd into Lawson's mouth, and over it was wrote, the thanks of the house, and now boys do cry in the street, kiss my parliament. So this is before your time, but perhaps you can set the scene and then tell us about 18th century graffiti. Where are we? What's going on in the world?
Okay, so, well, the long 18th century, as this book covers, is a debated duration. And Rebecca and I were talking about this in the Green Room, that 18th century historians in particular are incredibly greedy. We have this thing called the long 18th century, which is maybe 2 decades either side of the century, sometimes more, depending on what you fancy. So my long 18th century in this book starts in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution, the deposing of James II by William and Mary. And it continues, well, vaguely into the 1830s. I mean, maybe that's a little bit too greedy, and I'm sure there's Victorian historians who would be keen for me to stop there. But the period that I look at is an incredibly divisive one. It's a moment of real change across the globe, but in Britain and the British Empire in particular, we've got revolution in France, revolution in America, but revolution in Britain at home, we've got the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, we've got social change, we've got growing literacy like never before. We've got this new idea of the public space. People are gathering in a way that they haven't before. So in new coffee houses, writing in pamphlets. It's a really wordy era. It's an era where everyone has a voice, almost everyone. And graffiti is one of those things that allows people to have a voice who exist maybe on the margins or totally trampled by those systems of power in that new world that's coming into place. So that's the setting for some of the stories that I look at in the book, is this incredibly turbulent and exciting moment in history.
So let's set graffiti itself within the wider context. I am going to ask you what graffiti actually is. But before we get to that, what do we have in terms of the written landscape? What are people reading? What are they consuming? How are people communicating with one another?
Well, the 18th century, as I say, is this incredibly wordy moment. The novel is this new form that's coming in. People are writing letters to each other. There's, what's typically referred to by academics as the Republic of Letters. So people writing all across Europe and Europe's empires across the globe, communicating with each other like never before, sharing ideas. There's the so-called Enlightenment, of course, this revolution in science and art and learning, and that term in and of itself is an incredibly loaded term that carries all kinds of prejudices with it, and that's something that I explore in the book. So people are really communicating, speaking up, debating in public, publishing like never before. Print culture, satirical cartoons, pamphlets are flooding the market, and everywhere people are having their say. And graffiti gets mixed up in that, but graffiti is something that's existed, as you so brilliantly set up there with Pepys, Rebecca. It's something that's existed for a long time, since the dawn of humanity, really. The urge to leave one's mark is so incredibly important, and we see it in the medieval period, we see it certainly in the 17th century when the civil wars take place. But it's the 18th century when it changes from being this everyday occurrence, something that, if you walked into a medieval church, you would be as likely to see the priest drawing, carving on the wall as you would a parishioner. It was a totally normal thing to do. People would carve prayers on the wall, people would carve curses. If you were hoping for, a good harvest, you might draw a plough on the wall of your church, things like that. but it wasn't political in the sense that we might understand now. It wasn't potent or dangerous, certainly wasn't considered that way. Even the curses were, considered dangerous on a local level. These weren't having big political, national impact. And it's the 18th century where that changes. And by the end of the period that I cover in the book, graffiti is the thing that we recognize today as being illicit, overtly political, potentially dangerous. In Britain now, if you're caught graffitiing something, you can face up to 10 years in prison or a fine of up to £10,000, unless you're Banksy, and then of course you will make millions in the art auction houses. Although we can have this debate later of whether he is actually a graffiti artist, but I digress. So graffiti has a revolution of its own, really, in this era of revolution. And it's caught up in that wordiness, in that debate, in that conversation and argument, really, about what Britain is going to be, who can be a Briton, what life is like as a Briton, or indeed for people coming into contact with Britons around the world.
I think it's really interesting, and just actually touching on the Banksy reference there. My impression from modern day graffiti is there's always that sense that it's immediate and spontaneous and maybe opportunistic, whereas with Banksy, potentially, these are thought through images and paintings. How much of that immediacy do we see in 18th century graffiti, and what's the variety of graffiti? So you've spoken about, your book's called Writing on the Wall. Is it simply things on walls, or is it more?
It's not, but my publisher made me call it that. Writing on multiple surfaces didn't have quite the same ring. So I think really to answer that question, we need to define what graffiti is in the 18th century. And it is sort of anything and everything. The word itself doesn't come into play until the 19th century. So when archaeologists are digging Pompeii, and of course everyone knows the famous graffiti from Pompeii, it's covers so much of the surfaces that survive there. And if anyone isn't familiar with it, Google it, because it's mostly illicit and really rude. And it
very phallic, basically.
Yeah, it's very phallic. Yeah. Nothing changes in human nature. But it does make for good reading. So there was instead a whole host of words that would describe the marks that were being left on different surfaces. And there were different surfaces, walls, of course, but also floors, furniture, glass windows, drinking glasses, the margins of books, clothing. Everything and anything was fair game in this period. And I think that's something that we've largely lost in our society today, that any surface could and would have been written on. And so that brings to mind then a completely different urban environment, that people experienced those voices in their surroundings, in their communities in a different way. So some of the words that we used to describe graffiti were things like diary writing, diamond writing. That's one of my favorite forms of graffiti, where people sharpen sometimes a diamond ring, sometimes a diamond pen, a diamond-tipped pen. The poet Robert Burns does that fantastically well and is a prolific drunken graffitiist in various pubs around the Highlands. And just so many different words, things like hieroglyph, glyph, to chalk. People in the 18th century carried chalk in their pocket as a routine thing to use for all kinds of life moments, I suppose, if you're in a pub and you're having a card game, you might keep score of the game on the wall with chalk. And I can't tell you how many times I've come across records in courts of people who've been caught brawling in a pub because someone has drunkenly come and rubbed off the score of the game, and then all hell has broken loose and they've ended up punching someone. And to chalk up is to explain. This phrase becomes commonplace in the 18th century, and it comes from literally having a conversation with someone, and maybe you're asking for directions. You pull the chalk out of your pocket and you draw where they need to go, and that's happening routinely. So it really was incredibly varied in terms of the surfaces, in terms of who was doing it, in terms of the tools, I suppose, that were being used. People carved into surfaces with knives, with little tools, little tools that they would have. So things like women carried needles and little scissors with them and things like that. You could do graffiti with that. Anything with a sharp edge became a useful tool for graffiti. So yeah, huge variety, which of course, as a historian, is really exciting, but also makes it very difficult in terms of finding this stuff that doesn't have one single name to describe it and can be everywhere and anything. And 2, knowing when to stop. I could have written 10 books for everything that I found, but 1 had to do.
Well, let's lean into that a little bit then. So you mentioned chalk, which is obviously something that is made to disappear. We can wipe away chalk, and clearly the references that you've had have been from the historical archive rather than physical specimens. But where and how do you even begin researching this?
It was a really interesting project. So I trained as an art historian and as someone who deals with material culture. So I'm used to looking at, I suppose, historic sources that maybe you wouldn't traditionally use as a historian. I mean, I spend my fair share of time in the archives reading letters and diaries and all of that, and they're very worthwhile and useful. But I'm also interested in things like, I don't know, a lock of hair belonging to one of George III's children tied with a ribbon by Queen Charlotte. And that's something I found in the pages of a book once at the Royal Archives. And, what that can tell us about those people's lives and the things that they valued. Or, a piece of collage with lots of prints cut up and stuck back together from the 1820s, something like that. So I've always been interested in these, I suppose, alternative forms of historical record. I've been very interested in graffiti for a long time before I wrote the book, but really I understood it as the preserve of archaeologists. This is the interesting thing about it, that historians have been really, really slow to look at graffiti. And it's so interesting when I've been in conversation this year at various events with other historians, they're always like, oh, I've never thought of looking at it, which is interesting, whereas archaeologists, I'll hold my hands up and say they've been doing this work for a good 20, 30 years and doing it very well, thank you very much. So it was something that was new to me and new to the way that I'd trained. In terms of finding it, I did start with the stuff that survives, and there is no way to create a complete record of the graffiti that survives from this period, or indeed other historical time periods, largely because so much of it was done in buildings that are now in private ownership. So, of course, we'll never know what we don't know. And also, obviously, for every one piece of graffiti that survives, there might be 100 that have been, on buildings that have been pulled down or burned down or whatever it is, or just covered up. Painted over, that kind of thing. There was a door, I think a couple of months ago, at Dover Castle, that had been painted with layers and layers and layers of paint over 2 or 3 centuries. And recently, English Heritage took all the paint off, and they found graffiti from French prisoners of war from the Napoleonic Wars, including a depiction of Napoleon hanging from a gallows. And nobody knew it was there because of the paint. So it's really hard to get to this stuff and to find it. And I have to say, social media was incredibly useful. That I would put out calls to people and say, if you see graffiti that you think is from any historical time period, please send it to me, and I will research it. And people still do send me about 10 things a day, so thank you, but maybe stop now. So that was my sort of starting point. And then, as I built up an understanding of also the language around graffiti and the terms that people used, I could then start to search digital archives. And again, it's incredibly hard to find the parameters of that. There are terms that people use to describe graffiti that I just won't have come across and that other people might in the future. So it's really difficult to get to the heart of it. The useful thing about the 18th century compared to any other time period, though, is because people start to see graffiti as this increasingly dangerous thing, they start to take notice of it more. And so you see it appearing in the background of Hogarthian prints or in the background of paintings. You see it mentioned in people's diaries. There's a fantastic diary entry from a young teenage girl. She's about 17 in, I think, the 1770s, and she's riding with her father in a carriage through the city of London, and she keeps seeing graffitied penises everywhere, just written in chalk or sometimes in paint, because I suppose, teenagers will always want to do that. And she writes about seeing them and it making her blush, and she's so embarrassed, and she records going home and basically saying to her mother, keep seeing these drawings everywhere and they're making me a bit embarrassed, can we talk about it? And it's incredibly fascinating that, and those marks, of course, are long gone. They've been washed away probably the day after they were made, but we get these glimpses of them. And if this landscape, this objectscape, this surfacescape in the 18th century that has just completely disappeared, and actually the surfaces of the 18th century, the walls, the windows, the clothing, everything was writhing with these messages, these images, this writing. So it was a really exciting project. It was basically a treasure hunt. Like I just got incredibly giddy, and I do still talking about it. More so than any other project that I've worked on. This was really, really exciting, and I think that I'd planned the book, and then I'd done, plotted out what stories I wanted to tell, and then I would find something completely incredible and have to add on like 2 more chapters to it. So I had to stop somewhere, but the exciting thing is I hope that this is just the beginning and that historians will build on that, and there are millions more stories to be told with graffiti.
No, it's really interesting. I'm just wondering about the physical graffiti that you find. I mean, often, I don't know if anyone everybody who's probably gone to school, we used to, I know you're not supposed to, but some people used to write their name and then a date, and maybe a for and ever after it. But if you don't have the date, how do you go about dating this physical material? How do you know it's part of your long century?
It is tricky. It's difficult to do, and this is why archaeologists are so key to this process, I think. There are various different ways that you could do it. So you could look at the surface itself that it's built on, and obviously, if it's a piece of furniture, for example, made sometime after the 1770s, it couldn't possibly have been dated before then. One of the things that, this is certainly not an exact science, but something that you become quite literate in as you look more and more at graffiti is that the cursive hand of people changes over time, and you become quite quickly able to say, oh, that's from the 1810s, the 1820s, oh, that's certainly from the 80s, 90s, whatever. Something that happens in the 18th century, though, compared to other centuries, is people start to add dates to their graffiti. And it's an interesting shift in people's mentality, I think. So if you look at, as I say, medieval graffiti, if you walk into a parish church here in London or out in the countryside, you will see pictorial graffiti, so things like daisy wheels or hexafoils, all kinds of spells. You'll see crosses of various types, which carried very intricate and complicated different Christian meanings. But they're all very community-minded. They're all very interested in certainly religion and religious sort of connection between the physical world and God, and the sort of spirituality of that. But they're not necessarily interested in the individual. Things that people hope for, things people get angry about, is really a collective experience. This begins to change in the 17th century, a time period I know you're very familiar with, Rebecca, with the Civil War, and there's this displacement of people in the landscape moving through parishes, like in a I suppose, a new way, in an antagonistic way. And so you start to get people leaving behind things like, there's an amazing piece of graffiti. It's in a church near Ely, which I think I'm right in saying is Oliver Cromwell's birthplace, right?
Yeah.
It's near there. Someone nod if you know. And there's an incredible piece of graffiti in that church that just says, Roundhead, 1645.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's carved into the font of the church. And so you start to see people projecting and imposing something of their political beliefs, not just spiritual anymore, but also their physical presence in that place, but also in that moment, in that time. And this increases throughout the 18th century, and you get people wanting to mark themselves as individuals and as part of different political movements and ideas in time and space. And you get it all over the British Empire. So you see people carving their names and the dates of voyages, dates of battles, the names of ships, onto rocks on the northern coast of Canada, for example, where people went to look for the Northwest Passage, or you see it in the Caribbean. There's an amazing example on one of the Caribbean islands. It's in the book, I can't remember which one now, but it's a huge, vast water trough, probably the size of this space, that was made by the British Army out there to gather rainwater for the troops. And every surface has the names of soldiers who'd passed through that space carved into it. And what's interesting is they're carved in little groups that don't necessarily identify their ranks. So often you'll get like Captain such and such and then Sergeant such and such, but it's their friendship groups, or the men that they've fought with, or that they've traveled from home with or met up with or whatever. So you start to get this kind of interesting individualism, or this idea of tribes and tribalism in a way that you don't necessarily in previous centuries. yeah, sorry, that was a very rambling answer to
No,
that
it wasn't
question.
rambling. It was really interesting. Presumably as well, rising literacy rates play a key role in this as well.
Yes, they absolutely do. I mean, you still continue to get pictorial graffiti throughout the period, and nowhere more so really than in 18th century prisons, where literacy rates are statistically a little bit lower, not necessarily, but there you get people who will contribute images to an existing scene, which is very fascinating. And this idea, again, of the individual and the collective kind of playing an interesting role here. So there's an amazing prison cell that survives in the Museum of London, which I think has been closed for about 2 years, but it's about to reopen in Smithfield. And it's a wooden prison cell. It's probably the size of the stage that we're on, and the original walls still exist. And it's a fascinating space that you can go into, and I've stood in it for about 40 minutes once, and you can watch people go around the 18th century gallery, and they're looking at, the silk gowns and the gold gilded clocks, and they come into the cell and think, oh, I've walked into a cupboard, and then they just go out again. And I just sort of stood there going, no, look at the graffiti. But it's very dark in there, so it's understandable. But if you do look closely at it, there's graffiti covering every inch of it. And mostly it is images and not words. There are some words in there, but it's things like, so it was a debtor's prison, and it mostly catered for people who'd been in the Navy or were involved in maritime travel of some sort. It was located somewhere near the Tower of London. And there are anchors, there are ships, there are incredibly detailed sails and flags. But at head height, around the room, is a panorama of London that has been added to over about 4 decades by these prisoners. And you can see the different hands. You can see people carving at different depths, using different tools. And it's so specific. There are specific houses on there. And amazingly, there are different shops. Obviously, something we get in the 18th century, talking of literacy rates, shop signs, pub signs often were, if you go into the Red Lion, it might be literally a wooden or a plastic plaster lion painted red, something like that, rather than a sign that said that in words. And on this panorama, you can see the 3 balls of the pawnbroker, which is incredible when you think that that is a debtor's prison and how important and prevalent an institution like that might be to the people in that space. So you do get images as well. The hanged man in particular really, exists throughout the 18th century, but this idea, literally like, when you're a child and you play guessing the letter and you have to draw a gallows and a hanged man, it's pretty much that. That, I don't know if it begins in the 18th century prison, but certainly it has its moment in there, and we see it in art of the time, depicted on the walls of cells. We have discussions of prisoners leaving those marks when they're about to be executed, in the hours before their death. There's an incredible account that I came across, which was written by a prison jail keeper. And he talks about a young man who's about 17 years old, and he's been arrested for being a highwayman. And he takes, again, a piece of chalk, which interestingly he was allowed to bring into the prison. Maybe he was given it in the prison, I don't know. And he takes to the wall and he draws the scene of the crime. And I suppose he knew he was going to his death, so there's no need to pretend otherwise. And he draws himself robbing these people, and he writes a little account underneath. And then he draws himself, imagining himself on the gallows being hanged. And what's so incredible is, in the cell with him was a young man of a similar age who'd been brought from Africa, and he was enslaved. He'd escaped his master in London, and he'd been arrested. I can't remember what the crime is now, but he was very, very ill, and he was dying in the cell, and he'd been condemned to be executed, but he died in the cell before that was possible. And the young man who does the graffiti, instead of using chalk to mark this young man's presence in this space, he takes a piece of coal and he specifically writes on the wall that he wants to show the race of this man in order to record him and to record him accurately. So you see these images more often than words, I think, giving voice to people who are marginalized or who don't have a voice within that republic of letters and debate that's going on in terms of print culture. It's really fascinating, and it's incredibly exciting when you come across these references in the archives, but they're incredibly difficult to find. I can't even remember how I came across that. I must have been maybe searching for the word chalk in a digital database, something like that. But yeah, amazing stories and amazing sort of individual lives and glimpses into lives that, in the case of those two young gentlemen, have otherwise disappeared from the historic record. I couldn't find anything else about them.
It's really moving, actually. These stories, they're kind of people making sure that there's something of them that's left for posterity, which actually leads me to the next question I was going to ask, but you've kind of answered it already, but I'll ask it nevertheless, which is why do people leave graffiti? What's the purpose?
It's really varied. I think part of today we might think it's, people wanting to memorialize themselves, and certainly that's true, and we see that particularly in prisons, as I've said, people kind of wanting to mark themselves as being there in that space and alive in the moments before they're erased entirely. Sometimes it is literally just people want to draw a dick on the wall. Like, people literally, the spontaneity of that and the sort of provocativeness of it, I think. There are deeply political messages in the 18th century as well. And graffiti is used as part of all kinds of political campaigns. So things like the very bigoted and controversial, divisive politician John Wilkes in the middle of the 18th century. He becomes associated with the number 45. He has a newspaper called the North Briton, which I suppose maybe the equivalent would be like GB News or something today. It's kind of, set up in competition and combativeness with other traditional media of the time. And he criticizes the establishment, and in the 45th edition, he criticizes the king, and this gets him arrested, and it's incredibly controversial. And so the number 45 becomes associated with his political ideals, which are often anti-immigration, especially anti-French and anti-Catholic in that moment. And people start to draw the 45 across the city with alarming frequency, and it spreads his message. And they're drawing on things like doorways, carving into things. There's one man who gets arrested for writing the number 45 in chalk on a passing gentleman's cloak. Little does he know the gentleman is actually a judge. So that was unfortunate. They write on the sides of carriages, which of course then spreads the message across the city. So you get these slogans, these little boiled down images or ideas of a political movement that hop from surface to surface, and they can become really insidious and spread ideas good and bad.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, but I'm going to ask you now about a separate movement or political movement, which is the Jacobites, because graffiti's heavily tied up in their cause. Like, I've seen a lot of the material culture. I don't know if anybody's been up to Bannockburn and Culloden, seen the various bits and pieces they have there. But tell me about the graffiti side of things.
Yeah, so the Jacobite risings in the first decades of the 18th century, this is a very generalized Wikipedia summary of this, and if there are any Jacobite historians out there, I'm sorry. So in 1688, the Glorious Revolution happens, and James II is deposed by William and Mary, and eventually William and Mary give way to Queen Anne, and then the Hanoverians. And James flees to the continent, and his supporters and his son, and then his son, take up the cause and are always seeking to take back the English and then the British throne. And we see risings in Scotland, particularly among the Highlanders, although not exclusively, to try and dethrone the Hanoverians and give James and his supporters back the throne. And graffiti plays this enormous part on both sides of the conflict. So we see things like pro-Jacobite graffiti. So in 1745, the final campaign happens, which ends in 46, early in 46, at the Battle of Culloden, which is a brutal putting down of the Jacobite forces by the Hanoverians. And it's an incredibly harrowing scene, and it's well known as a sort of turning point in that movement. The Jacobite army starts off in Scotland, and it comes all the way down to Derby. I spoke at Derby the other day, and they were extremely excited to be mentioned in the book. And there's no specific reason why they stop at Derby other than they're very exhausted and they're on their way to London. And then the generals all decide they need to go back up north, and it's not going to work out. And the Hanoverian forces start to come from London. So In that movement down to Derby and then back again, people leave pro-Jacobite graffiti in taverns, in coffee houses, all along that route, all the way down through Cumbria and into Derbyshire. And some of that still survives. There's a pub in Lancashire that still has a piece of Jacobite graffiti in its window. I think it says something like, God save the Bonnie Prince or something, a reference to Bonnie Prince Charlie, who is the, I think, grandson of James II. And so you get, again, these ideas, these political ideas, insidiously spreading and seeding themselves in the everyday landscape of people's lives. And it works as a recruitment campaign. People really do see that graffiti and join the Jacobite army, much to their bad luck. But on the other side, you have the Hanoverian graffiti, which is incredibly anti-Jacobite and specifically anti-Scottish. Being Scottish, well, being a Highlander and being Jacobite kind of become slightly synonymous in this period. And one of the most incredible sights I saw for graffiti, and really unusual graffiti, was in Berwick-upon-Tweed. Now, if anyone knows that, it's nowadays right in the northeast corner of England, but it's been Scottish at various points, it's been English again, it's gone back and forth, and it's an incredible fortified town. I think there's some loophole where, I think it was in maybe the 19th century, there was some kind of war with part of like Russia or something, and when the peace treaty was signed, someone forgot to put Berwick in there, and so technically they're still at war with Russia or something like that. Anyway, but again, I digress. Anyway, in this town, there's an 18th century barracks that was built specifically as a sort of frontline defence against any Jacobite risings that might happen over the border. And you can go into the space where the soldiers, these English soldiers and Scottish soldiers on the side of the Hanoverians slept, and all on the ceiling are smoke graffiti. So these are graffiti that are made using a stencil. It can be the back of your hand, or it could be a piece of cut-out paper or card or a weapon or anything. And then you blacken it with a lit candle. And there are all kinds of things. And as anyone who has any familiarity with soldiers will know, there's a lot of smut on there. Like a lot of smut. But there's also an entire deck of cards that someone's cut out and then made in this smoke graffiti. And there is only one playing card in that deck that you would find in a real deck. The others are all things like, I don't know, a card with like a duck on or a church spire or something. And this one card was the 9 of Diamonds, and it was known at the time as the Curse of Scotland. And it was basically an anti-Scottish calling card, for want of a better word. And you see it repeated again and again all over the ceiling. And so you can see the mentality of these people on this front line facing the Scots, not knowing when another rising was going to happen. And there were multiple risings at the beginning of the century, and all very bloody. And being on that front line and really doubling down on that message and I suppose enhancing their own prejudices, their own fears, their own ideas of who the Scots were on the other side of the border. And you see it absolutely embedded in the material environment.
So interesting, so interesting. So we've spoken about politicization, I suppose, of graffiti, the motives for creating graffiti in that way. Graffiti also, to me, has always, if you see it just in the street or on walls, there's always an element of shaming someone. There's always someone named, so-and-so is this, so-and-so is that. We have a similar thing in the 18th century, don't we, with sex workers and reviews. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, so these are so fascinating because it brings you face to face with women, primarily, not exclusively, who were working in the sex industry, the sex trade in the early 18th century. So in 1731, there's a book published in London that becomes an instant bestseller, and it's called The Merry Thought or the Bog House Miscellany. And it's essentially a collection of graffiti from the back of toilet doors, from the walls of taverns, from the alleyways around the city. And it was collected by an anonymous editor who calls himself Hurlo Thrumbo, which...
It's the best name.
It's such a great name. It was the name of a character in a comedy play the year before. So everyone in the city would have known this was absolutely, a joke thing. But the graffiti was real. And each location would be recorded. So you get graffiti from the piazza at Covent Garden, for example, or outside Drury Lane Theatre, and, places that are still recognisable today. And incredibly, there's graffiti recorded that mentions sex workers, graffiti supposedly left by sex workers, and we know Covent Garden in particular was an area where brothels were particularly frequent, in amongst other entertainments. You know, there was drinking and theatre and lots of other things to be had, and sex work was very much just sort of part of that landscape. And on the one hand, you get graffiti left by punters who've had a good time and punters who have not had a good time. There's one that springs to mind. I don't know if you've written it down or anything, Rebecca, but it's a rhyming couplet, and it says something like, "I lay Celia down. She got half a crown." No, hold on. What is it? I want to get it right. It's like, She got half a crown and I got the pox or something. And there are so many complaints of people who, you know, say, don't come into Madam whatever's brothel because you'll get infected. And then you get the sex workers' voices themselves, often written on tavern walls where they're plying their trade and looking for custom. And you get women advertising themselves and the services that they offer. You get women who are very enthusiastic about what they do. And you also get women who tell a completely different story and, you know, talk about them being forced into this, otherwise they would have starved, or they're feeding their children. And so you get, again, this idea of a public space that's full of debate, that's full of variety in these different people's lives. And it's one of the times as well where you get the closest glimpse that you can to voices that aren't recorded in the archives. So a lot of the sex workers are referred to as moll, or Molly, and we know in the 18th century, Molly houses were in fact brothels that catered to men, and men were working there. It was, you know, homosexual space primarily, and often with these graffiti, you can't tell the gender of the person who has left the mark, and so it opens up a whole kind of ambiguous question about who some of these mark makers were. And I'd love to think that some of them weren't women, and that you get part of that experience in a way that you don't elsewhere in the archives often. So it's a kind of interesting ambiguity. But the Boghouse Miscellany, it's all digitized, and I really recommend that people go and read that because it gives you such an insight into people's lives.
Well, obviously, after you've also bought this book
obviously.
as well. I'm aware that we're close to time now. I think there's going to be some time for audience questions, but I've got two more quick questions for you. What's the most common type of graffiti to survive? I think I know the answer to this.
That is an interesting one. I think from this period is mostly people's initials or names and the dates, which isn't a very sexy answer. But I think, again, it speaks to this changing idea of the 18th century and people wanting to sort of mark themselves in that space. Either that or the hanged man and gallows. You do get that a lot.
Oh, okay.
You get it on the back. There's an amazing example in Edinburgh Castle, which is American revolutionaries kept there in the 1770s. And there's, on the back of a cell door, a hanged man and gallows, and then the name of the then Prime Minister, Lord North, written underneath it. So you do get these, surviving in a lot of the historic sites that we know and love today.
Okay, next and final question from me before we go to audience questions. What's your favourite piece of graffiti?
Oh, that's so hard. I think, for me, my favourite piece has to be a really everyday, innocuous piece of chalk graffiti that, in 1688, the year of the Glorious Revolution, caught a murderess in her crime. This was a woman who killed her abusive, drunken husband. She strangled him and then cut him up and put all of his body parts in the public latrines in and around Covent Garden. Good for her. One of his friends came by to find him and took a piece of chalk out of his pocket and wrote a note on the door to say, "Hi, came by, you weren't in, meet me at the chapel down the road tomorrow, I've got a job for you." And she made the mistake of answering that herself and going. And then when she sees the friend, she says, "Oh, no, he's gone away to the West Indies. He's gone." The friend is really suspicious. And then in the days that follow, the body parts start to turn up and he puts two and two together and she gets caught for it. And it's just such a frustrating and incredible moment that this piece of graffiti that is so mundane and so otherwise uninteresting and everyday, and that would have been, the same as 1,000 others written that day on the city, catches out this extraordinary moment of violence.
It's always the way, always the way. There's a great chapter on that in the book as well. Audience questions.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. It's very, very interesting. Madeleine, how do you find new sources of graffiti? That's my question. short.
How do I find sources of graffiti in the 18th century?
Like, how do you find new sources? Like, where do you sort of go to find possible? Because it must be getting more difficult and more difficult because places are being removed. Like you say, places are going down all the time. Do you do like archaeologists? Do you go and sort of try to look at something if you know it's going to be taken down? I suppose that's...
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's sort of it's a treasure hunt, really. I'm always the strange person at any National Trust or English Heritage property, not looking at like the paintings on the wall. I'm looking at the wall itself, and you can see, the security guards eyeing me, thinking, "What is she doing?" My husband refuses to come with me to these things now. He's too embarrassed. I mean, there are a lot of projects to find and record graffiti, mainly done by archaeologists, God bless them. But there's no centralized database of any of this. There's lots of regional projects to do this, but no one's really joining up the dots. And so often it can be quite random finding this stuff. One thing that I've discovered, though, is that it is so ubiquitous still. If you go to any historic building, the likelihood is you will find something. It could be, written in pencil from the 1940s by a soldier about to deploy, or it might be a medieval prayer or something. And these things, once you start to look for them, you do see them everywhere. And I always apologize to my audiences because honestly now that's all you will see when you go anywhere, and you'll be like me looking at the walls and not the paintings in historic properties. So it's a mixture of everything, but it's an adventure to find it. It's very good fun.
I was interested in people's attitude generally towards graffiti and also the legal aspects to it. And, like here in Tower Hamlets, there's a team of council workers who go around removing graffiti. Generally, people talk about in meetings the problem of graffiti. I just wondered how people's attitudes towards that changed or what?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly by the end of the 18th century, this attitude was already in place. And that was largely because graffiti had been embroiled in some of the political moments that we've spoken about, but so many others as well, and that it had caused real sort of civic unrest and mob violence in some cases. It became in Britain also associated with the French Revolution. There was a lot of graffiti in Paris following 1789, and this idea that graffiti was somehow uncivilized, that it was dangerous, that it could be violent, had really taken root in Britain. You don't see it legislated against until the 19th century, interestingly. And even then it's quite sort of inconsistent in terms of how that's enforced. There's a great example I found, and I have it at the end of the book, of a man on Orkney who was found with a chisel and a hammer carving his name into the cathedral there. And he was arrested and he was taken to court. And his defense was that the whole wall was covered in graffiti, including the name of Queen Victoria's own nephew who'd come and done his mark like a month earlier. And that didn't save him. And he got, I think, a month's hard labor and was fined £1, which was, a reasonable amount then. So you start to see people taking offense to this. And certainly that attitude hasn't changed. I think at the moment we're in an interesting time where historical institutions are starting to be interested in historic graffiti, but at the same site they won't let anyone add to that. So, there's incredible efforts within both English Heritage and the National Trust to record what exists. But certainly if you were caught, carving your name into a 14th century castle that is in their care, they wouldn't be pleased about it. There's also an interesting divide, I think, between street art and graffiti at the moment, and we talked about Banksy, within that, and I think certainly if you look in this area, I'm thinking particularly about some of the street art in Brick Lane, there are designated spaces for that. But I think there is a distance then between graffiti as being a spontaneous, provocative, momentary sort of expression of something, and street art, which is in its own right very powerful, but is often legally allowed, it's designated a space, it's sort of invited. And that, for me, slightly loses some of the power, I think. And I think, if we're talking about it in terms of graffiti. So I think there's an interesting moment with all those kind of complications. And that's why I wonder sometimes if Banksy is necessarily a graffiti artist anymore, or a street artist, actually. And, the efforts to, for example, put perspex over his latest works with the animals as a historian of graffiti, it's very exciting to see that being preserved. But I suppose it preferences works by people like Banksy over the myriad other voices within that same space that will get overwritten and washed away and whatever. And that is part of the nature of graffiti, that it's ephemeral, that it can be destroyed, and that it's people having their say, and the conversation continues and continues. So yeah, it's an interesting, complicated question, but I think we are at a moment where we're very interested in graffiti. It's very divisive, but I think hopefully people can start to see the value in it as well as the dangers.
Do you know when the Italian word was adopted and whether that made any difference to how graffiti is viewed?
So it was in about the 1840s, 1850s when the first sort of big excavations started to happen at Pompeii. Pompeii was being excavated before that in the 18th century, but the Victorians really started to do it in a sort of serious scholarly way. And the word was really used by French, German, and English archaeologists in Italy. It's a sort of bastardization of the Italian word for to scratch or to make a mark. I think we do see that coinciding with it becoming viewed as a problem elsewhere. And I think it comes down to, again, that divide between graffiti from the past. Isn't it quaint? Isn't it interesting? Look at these Romans and all the things that they wanted to write on the wall. And a distaste for the same things being written on the wall in the present moment. So I think I don't think the word graffiti is responsible for our mistrust of it, but I think there's an interesting parallel there, definitely, and it happens at the same moment.
Could I just ask about the period from the Civil War to the 18th century, a period of warfare, obviously, conflict, but also increasing literacy. So did graffiti get better from the Civil War to your period?
Define better.
More literate? Better spelling?
Certainly not better spelling. I mean, people throughout history really have varied spelling, shall we say. I think certainly there is more of it from the Civil War onwards. I mean, Rebecca is a historian of that time period, so she will know more than me. But I think some of the examples that stand out for me actually are pictorial from that period as well as literary. There's some great drawings of Civil War of parliamentarian soldiers in the chapels at Cambridge, for example, when that space was taken over by Cromwell's army. So you get, I think it's more about people imposing themselves onto new spaces rather than showing off their new literacy. Generally, though, there is more written graffiti. By the end of the long 18th century, at least, there's more written graffiti than there is pictorial.
Just a really quick one on the Civil Wars. There's a really fun example of some boots that were worn by royalist soldiers in my local museum in Chester. And they have, on the boots, they've etched in the image of Charles as well to show. I mean, they would have known what side they were on, but it was just so they knew too.
That's really interesting. Yeah, there's sort of the imagery of your political or your spiritual or religious stance, your identity, and sort of carving the repetition of that and the emphasis of it by carving it into your belongings or your environment. Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah.
Hello. I was just thinking about the book by Herlo Thrumbo you're talking about. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And I was interested to ask you who read it, like what was its readership like, who was interested by it, because I was thinking about, the way that graffiti now, or maybe in the past 10 years, I think has been, I don't know, you were talking about like the connection between graffiti and street art and how, graffiti can kind of become this sort of like niche thing that middle-class people want to emulate, and I wanted to ask about whether that was a similar thing that happened around the book by the book that you mentioned.
Yeah, Herlo Thrumbo, you got it.
Herlo Thrumbo, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Thank you so much for that. The readership was really varied, and it was an instant bestseller, and it went through, I think, like 4 or 5 editions just in the month it came out, so everyone read it. But the thing was, everyone did graffiti, from the richest to the poorest, so it wasn't necessarily middle-class people co-opting something that was, primarily from the lower classes. As much as I suppose that book was a mirror held up to a society that considered itself to be quite polite and quite well behaved, and actually it was like peeping through the keyhole and seeing, you know, what people really get up to, and being sort of presented with all of it. And I think what people loved about it as well was that it showed the way that different classes, different genders, different religions all sort of, I suppose, locked horns across, first of all, London. But as it became more popular, people would start to write in and send graffiti from other parts of the country that they lived in, and they would get published. There's an amazing example of a line or two from a tavern in Chelsea, which of course then would have been just a village, that comes from someone who lost all their money in the South Sea collapse, which was this massive financial crisis. The wealthy went completely crazy, investing huge amounts of money, and it all went tits up. And surprise, surprise. And there was huge hatred of financiers in the 1720s and 30s, which is, you know, maybe something we can understand today. And there's a few lines where someone says, you know, oh, poor me, I lost all my money in this crisis and I don't know what to do. And underneath someone just writes, ha, ha, ha. So, you know, so it's kind of combative, and it's like an ugly version of this polite world. And I think that's what people loved about it. So, yeah.
I think we got time for just one more question, so, yeah.
Yeah, picking up on what this guy said here, I'm interested in where we are today, rather than the 17th and 18th century, with all respect, because it's a fascinating talk. I just wonder, because we live in such an ephemeral society, walls don't exist very long, they get knocked down and then you have skyscrapers put up. So where's graffiti gone? I mean, I was thinking of these people who are like begging on the streets with signs. Is that graffiti today?
That's an interesting question. I think I would say that that's not graffiti because it's not being imposed onto a communal space, I think. But then graffiti doesn't necessarily have to be. Yeah, that's an interesting and hard one to define. I think the question of how we treat graffiti now, how we understand it, and how we maybe record it is a really interesting one. I did an event recently with someone who works with Alternate London. I don't know if anyone's come across them. They do incredible tours of the street art in and around Brick Lane, actually. And he was talking about his ambitions to set up a museum of graffiti in London and what that would look like, and how you might start to record things, but how also you take away some of the power of graffiti if you take it out of the environment that it's in. You know, often graffiti is in dialogue with the building that it's on, or you know, the location that it's in is meaningful in some way to the message that's being left. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think because we have, on the one hand, this criminalization of it, and then also this elevating of it, and certainly the commercialization of it, thinking again about Banksy, and I don't mean to unfairly single him out. There are other, you know, commercial. I know, yeah. Sorry if you are Banksy. And please come and talk to me afterwards if you are. But yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question, and I don't think we have the answer to it yet. I think graffiti in our own moment has so much value. There's incredible projects digitally as well. There's an Instagram account that's run anonymously that just collects pro-Palestinian graffiti from around the world, and people, a bit like Hurlo Thrumbo, send in images that they've seen in their own countries. And it's an incredible account to follow, and of course it's just, you know, one viewpoint on an ongoing conflict. But I think it shows how in our digital world, in a world where our environment is certainly surveyed and controlled to a certain extent, it can still have that power to subvert and to disrupt, and to give voice to the voiceless. So I think it has power still, and I think that's why it still makes us uncomfortable, and we're not really sure how to deal with it.
Fantastic. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.